Hey, welcome back to another video, another lecture. And this time we're gonna be looking at chapter 7. Hopefully you guys have had a good weekend. I'm actually recording this on Tuesday right now. So I'm sure your week has started. And I hope it had a really good start, okay? So currently we're just gonna be looking at chapter 7. And chapter 7 is gonna be our first foray into understanding how financial markets work. And basically understanding how financial institutions play a crucial role in generally the economy, right? So we look at the key topics of finance, savings, and investments, okay? And also how interest rates actually determine in the economy, right? How does the government or government's policies basically affect financial markets, right? So before we actually delve into this sort of chapter, right, and delve into like the confusing concepts, maybe, right, I want you to sort of think about a world where there is basically no financial institution, there's basically no First National Bank, there's no Bank of Americas, there's no Citibank, there's no Wells Fargo, right? I want you to carefully think of a world. So take a minute, just carefully think of a world where there are basically no financial institutions, right? And sort of try and see how such a world is. So it might probably be a chaotic world, okay? Just take a minute and think of such a world, okay? So as you think of that world, think of why are banks or financial institutions really important, right? Why are they really crucial for the economy, or why are they really crucial in society just in general, okay? So I just want you to take a minute and just try and see if you can answer the question, okay? But I'll just give you three basic answers, which I think will probably help you sort of see why financial institutions are really crucial, right? Well, first of all, is savings, right? They help us actually save our money. Imagine all this income we actually making, okay? All the income you actually make, and you don't have anywhere to save it, right? Or even if you want to save it, it's gonna be really cumbersome. You need to buy a vault. You need to make sure that people are not gonna rob you, or people are gonna intrude into your house and take your money. Right, you probably be scared for your life. Well, if your vote gets filled up, where else are you going to keep the money? Are you going to keep it under the bed? Are you going to keep it in the closet? Right? So financial institutions and generally banks basically are there to help us save. Also, they are there to actually lend us money. So just in case we want to buy a boat, we want to buy a house, we want to buy a car, right? We want to buy something fancy or want to pay for college and we don't have the money to actually do that, right? We actually walk into a financial institution or we walk into a bank, right? And we basically ask for money. We ask for funds to actually pay off maybe or help us secure a loan for a house or maybe a boat or a car or maybe something really fancy, okay? Right, and also financial institutions help us make transactions, okay? So you don't have to be carrying cash everywhere you go, basically, right? Financial institutions make it so easy for you to actually go into Walmart and just swipe your card and just make a transaction because they basically back your credit, right? But savings and borrowing and all transactions, what do they really depend on, right? What do you look out for when you're checking for which bank to place your money in? There's one keyword, and the keyword I'm actually looking for is basically interest rates, okay? So interest rates basically drive financial institutions, right? They determine savings and they determine how much people want to invest. And in this chapter, that is basically what we're going to look at, okay? So this chapter is basically to show you how the financial markets and financial institutions work. Just in case you're thinking to yourself, Dr. Kweku, why do I need to know this? Okay, you need to know this because look what happened in 2007 and 2008. Okay, financial institutions nearly collapsed, financial markets nearly collapsed, okay? And it led to a world recession, okay? In Asia in 1997 and 1998, there was the Asian financial crisis and there was a massive recession over there as well, okay? Right, and I know it's difficult to have an asynchronous class, okay, and sometimes it's difficult to stay dedicated to the videos, okay, watching the videos, so you don't have a set time, like, you go to a class over Zoom, or you go to a class, face-to-face, right? But please, 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 please make sure you actually watch the videos, and if you actually have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me, okay? Send me an email or come to my office hours or set an appointment via Zoom, and I'm more than willing to actually talk to you about those videos or those basically concepts, basically, right? Also, you can send you can send an email, making so many mistakes. You can send an email to basically your SI, okay, and about any questions or about the homework, and he's more than willing to actually help you out, okay? So let's look at current interest rates in the United States, okay? So current interest rates are usually determined by what we call the 10-year Treasury constant maturity rate, okay? And current interest rates in the United States are pretty low, okay? So if you're actually thinking of saving money, yeah, you might probably not have much of a good return on it, right? I think the current interest rate is around 0.68%, okay? So the Treasury rate is the return on investment on US debt. Think of it as the interest rate the US government pays to borrow money for over 10 years, okay? And it is important because this also influences the majority of interest rates, such as real estate or cars or equipment, right? And it also tells us how the investors basically feel about the economy, right? So basically, if investors don't really feel good about the economy, they actually buy a whole lot of treasury bills, a whole lot of bonds, okay? Because those are really, really safe. It's backed by the US government. You're always going to get your payback, or you're always going to get your income back, okay? Right. Well, the problem is that once you actually buy a bond, you know that demand increases the price of a good, right? So as the price goes up, there's an inverse relationship between the price of a bond, right, and the interest rate. So as the price goes up, the interest rates decreases. That's why this shaded area basically gives us the recession, and we have interest rates basically down over here, right? And like I said, the 10-year Treasury constant maturity rate basically influences all other interest rates. So as we see with the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in the United States, which is currently around 3% or 2.9%, right? Interest rates are really, really low. So 30-year fixed mortgage rates are super low right now. Okay, so if you're thinking of buying a house, maybe this is actually the time. Okay, it's actually good to buy a house when interest rates are this low. Okay. Right, and interest rates also determine savings rates, okay? And let's look at the savings rates in the United States, okay? During a recession, people tend to save more because of uncertainty, which is understandable. But look at this, during the height of the COVID recession, right, Americans saved 33.7% of their income, okay? So generally, savings are determined by interest rates, but the other factors actually determine savings as well, okay? During high recession, which is basically the shaded gray areas, people tend to save more. Okay, and usually during a recession, businesses tend to invest less because they gain uncertainty. So during the COVID recession, right, investment levels basically dropped to roughly 2014 levels. Okay, and we'll look at these things in more detail later on. So after studying this chapter, okay, I always like to go to the learning objectives. Once you understand the learning objectives, you basically have mastered the chapter. Okay. So after studying this chapter, you should be able to describe the flow of funds in financial markets. You should be able to explain how financial decisions are made and the risks that arise from those decisions. Explain how lending and borrowing basically work in financial markets, and explain how government policies basically influence financial markets as well, okay? Right, so the first thing we're going to delve into is the basic definitions, okay? So we need to understand financial markets and financial institutions, but we need to understand the word finance, okay? Because it basically drives financial markets and financial institutions, okay? So we need to distinguish between finance and money, and also we need to distinguish between what we call physical capital and financial capital, okay? So what is finance? Well, finance is basically looking at borrowing and lending decisions and how these decisions are made, and how they interact to influence interest rates and macroeconomic performance, okay? So whenever you think of finance, and that's what we're going to be looking at the most in this chapter, whenever you think of finance, think of lending and borrowing, okay? And finance is different from money, okay? Money is basically sort of used for the transaction of goods and services, right? So how much consumers and firms hold money, how banks create money, and how money basically influences the economy, right? So money is basically the thing that we use to pay for goods and services, okay? Finance and money are related, but in this chapter, we'll focus more on finance, okay? And also, we need to differentiate between physical capital and financial capital. Every time we talk about capital in accounting or finance, right, capital is basically the money used to sort of invest in a business, okay? But in economics, capital is quite different, okay? Capital refers to the tools, machinery used by firms to produce goods and services, okay? That is what we say is capital in basically accounting, right? And well, that's what we say capital is basically in economics, right? And in accounting and finance, right, capital is basically financial capital, which is funds that firms use to buy physical capital, okay? So that is basically financial capital, okay? So for example, if Amazon uses $10 million to build a warehouse for packaging in Seattle, right, the $10 million is basically financial capital, okay? and the warehouse is basically the capital, right? The warehouse for packaging is basically the capital, right? Or if a farmer decides to basically use $100,000 to buy a harvester, right? Well, harvesters are pretty expensive, by the way. I didn't know this till I actually researched this, but they're pretty expensive. Anyway, if a farmer uses $100,000 to buy a harvester, the harvester is the physical capital, or the capital we talk about in economics, and the $100,000 is basically the financial capital, okay? Capital in an economy is very important because the more goods and services you have, right, generally the more GDP you have. But how can you have more goods and services? You can only have more goods and services if you actually decide to invest in machinery to produce those goods and services, okay? So there's a link between capital and investment, okay? The more capital a firm will produce or invest in, the more goods and services they can produce, and hence the higher GDP, okay? So the quantity of capital in an economy is generally good for economic growth, okay? Right, but this quantity of capital, right, in the economy basically depends on what we call gross investment. So we already defined investment in chapter 4. We said investment is when firms basically purchase new capital, right, to actually produce goods and services. Gross investment is a more specific definition, okay? So gross investment is the total amount spent on purchases of new capital and on replacing depreciated capital. Well, you probably ask yourself, Dr. Kwaku, what does depreciation actually mean? What is this fancy word? Well, depreciation in economics and also finance is the wear and tear of capital, okay? So you buy a harvester, over time the harvester decreases in value, okay? You buy a computer, over time the computer decreases in value, okay? So when machinery and capital and equipment decrease in value and they have some wear and tear, is basically depreciation, or if they become obsolete over time, is also considered as depreciation, okay? And to actually determine or decipher the quantity of capital in the economy, right, we actually need to look at essentially what we call net investment. And net investment is the change in the quantity of capital, okay? Right? So net investment is definitely defined as gross investment minus depreciation, okay? And that is what we call by net investment. And actually take a look at an example of net investment, okay? Right, so let's look at this company. This company's initial capital, right, was $30,000. And over time, the capital depreciated by $20,000. Okay, so you have depreciation of $20,000, right, from 30 to 10. Okay, and now the initial capital is basically only 10,000 because depreciation occurred. Okay, and because of depreciation, this company decides to make an investment. So it makes an investment of $30,000. Okay, and from there we can actually have its final sort of investment, which is going to be $40,000. So that's his net investment plus the initial capital it basically had, okay? Right, so that is how capital, gross investment, depreciation, and net investment basically look like, okay? Right, and then we have wealth and savings. So savings is basically used towards investment, okay? So savings is important because the amount of money which is saved in the economy is basically the amount of money which eventually is invested, okay? Right, and in that sense, right, savings is basically linked to wealth, okay? So wealth is essentially the value of all things that people own, okay? So saving is the amount of income that is basically left over if basically you done paying your taxes or you consuming goods and services, okay? And savings generally in an economy is translated into investment, and investment is translated into acquiring more capital, which is basically helps GDP grow, okay? But savings also leads to more wealth. The more savings you have, the more assets you can basically acquire, and hence the more wealth you tend to have, okay? So savings basically increases wealth, okay? And wealth is also influenced by what we call capital gains, okay? So capital gains is when the market value of your assets, remember I said wealth is the value of all the assets that people tend to own, okay? So when the market value of capital when the market value of assets tend to increase, we call it capital gains, and capital gains influences or increases wealth. Okay, so the more capital gains you have, the more happy you are. Okay, when the market value of your assets decrease, okay, basically we call it capital losses, and capital losses tend to decrease wealth. Okay, so the more capital losses you have, the sadder you actually become. Okay, right. Now, let's take a look at an example just to make sure you guys are understanding everything. So maybe this is the right time to pause the video, okay, and just take a look at this example. See if you can actually complete it, okay? So we have Jackson, an internet service provider who bought an existing business worth $400,000 on December 31st, 2018. During 2019, his business grew and he bought $500,000 of new servers. The market value of old servers fell by $100,000, okay? What is Jackson's gross investment, depreciation, and net investment in 2018? Okay, so to determine his gross investment, remember we said gross investment, which is basically GI for short, is when a firm acquires new capital. Okay, so Jackson is in the internet service provider business. Okay, so his capital is basically new servers. Okay, so him acquiring new capital is basically $500,000, right? So in this sense, his gross investment is $500K. Right, and what about depreciation? Well, we said depreciation is the wear and tear of capital. Okay, so his capital is basically the amount of servers, right? So we have depreciation equaling 100K. And what about his net investment? Well, we know net investment is basically GI, which is gross investment minus depreciation. So we have net investment being 500K. Minus 100K, and his net investment should basically be equal to 400K. Right, basically that's simple. Okay, right, so that gives us an idea of how gross investment, depreciation, and net investment basically looks like. Okay, remember I said basically financial markets, right, are sort of links, they sort of link savers to borrowers. Okay, so we said saving is the source of funds used to finance investments, and sometimes businesses want loans to purchase some capital, and households or consumers want a loan to buy a boat, a vehicle, or some house, and this is usually provided by commercial banks. Okay, so what are the sources of funds used to finance investments, right? And these sources are basically located in three types of financial markets. We have what we call the loan market. Okay, so the loan market is basically any market where loans are basically given. So think of the market of commercial banks, right, where you can actually walk in and basically receive a loan, for example. And then we have the bond market. And a bond market basically is a market where bonds are traded. Well, what is a bond? You probably say to yourself, Dr. Kwaku, what is a bond, right? A bond is basically a promise by a company to pay a certain amount of money at a specific period in time. So you buy a certificate from a company. Let's say you buy a certificate worth $100 from a company. You keep that certificate, which has $100 written on it, okay? And the company promises to pay you $100 with a certain interest at a specific time period. So maybe let's say 2 years from now, okay? Basically, it's almost like you loaning the company money, okay? So think of bond as debt to the company, or you loaning the company basically money. And we have the stock market, and the stock market is basically a market where, or a financial market where shares of a company are usually traded, okay? So the company basically divides itself into a million pieces, okay? And decides to sell those million pieces out to people for funds to invest. Okay, right? So if you buy shares in Apple, it basically means that you own 0.000000000000000000001% of Apple, and you're entitled to 0.00000000000000001% of Apple's shares profits. Okay. And basically firms actually do that because they actually want to have funds for investment. And then we also have financial institutions. Okay, so financial institutions is basically any firm that basically links savers and borrowers. Okay, so that is their main job, right? The key financial institutions we have in the U.S. economy are basically commercial banks. Okay, so these are your Bank of America. These are your First National banks. These are your local city banks. Okay, and they accept deposits, make payment services, and they also help in making loans. Okay, right? And then we have government-sponsored mortgage lenders. Okay, and these help you sort of finance mortgages. Okay, so we have what we call Fannie Mae. Right, so Fannie Mae is basically the Federal National Mortgage Association, and we have what we call Freddie Mac. Okay, so Freddie Mac is the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation. And what they do is that they actually buy mortgages from other banks. Okay, so mortgages banks have lent to individuals. They buy those mortgages from banks, package it as a financial security, and sell it to other buyers who actually sort of get income from them. Okay, right. And then you have what we call a mutual fund and pension fund. So mutual funds basically are financial institutions that take your money and they buy a whole lot portfolio of stocks and bonds and other financial securities and some income from them. And pension funds are basically, they use pension contributions from firms and workers to buy bonds and stocks as well. Okay, and then you have insurance companies. Okay, and insurance companies basically help you cope with risks such as accidents, thefts, some sickness. Okay, and then finally you have the Federal Reserve. Okay, so the Federal Reserve, we'll look at it in more detail when we're looking at chapter 8, but the Federal Reserve is the bank to all banks. Essentially, right, if your local bank runs out of money, which sometimes is the case, they actually go to the Federal Reserve to actually borrow. Okay, so it's the central bank and it's the bank to all other banks. If your bank needs money, where does it go? Well, it goes to the Federal Reserve. Okay, so that is what we have for this part of the chapter.